Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the I3 public webinar on challenges and lessons learned in assessing social emotional learning for SEL. My name is Diana Wogan, and I'm part of the technical assistance team for the Investing in Innovation program. Before we start, I want to review a couple of housekeeping items. You'll notice that your phone lines are muted. That's just to cut down on background noise today, but you can ask any questions you may have in the chat box. So to find the chat box, you can just hover over the menu on the right. You should see a little triangle next to the word chat, and click on that, and it will bring up a chat box where you can type in your message. And when you do type in a question, please make sure that you send it to all participants so we can all see it. We'll take questions towards the end of the webinar today. So we've seen that social emotional learning is a part of many I3 projects, but there are some challenges around assessing these skills, and that's why we're having this webinar today. We hope that you'll learn about 2 I3 projects that are assessing students' social emotional learning and understand their ongoing lessons learned around this assessment. We also hope you'll learn about how I3 grantees and other schools use information about students' SEL and learn about a couple of selected SEL assessment tools along the way. So here's our agenda for today. We'll provide a quick overview of the I3 program and SEL assessment, and then we'll hear from Jeremy Taylor from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. Then we'll hear from our I3 grantees. First, Laura Dreyer from College Possible, and then Amanda Moreno and Stephen Baker from the Erickson Institute in Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. And we'll end with a panel discussion and questions and answers. So a little bit about the Investing in Innovation Fund. Through I3, the U.S. Department of Education has funded 172 grantees across all 50 states. And these grantees are meant to develop innovative practices that can serve as models for others to learn from, take to scale those practices that have demonstrated effectiveness, and conduct rigorous school-based research to enable grantees in the education field more broadly to learn more about the effectiveness of various practices. And these grantees include projects that are influencing the development of non-cognitive factors, such as the grantees we'll hear from today. But what do we mean by social emotional learning assessment? Well, SEL can have many different meanings. In fact, there's over 100 frameworks to capture social emotional competencies. Similarly, SEL assessment can have many different purposes. It can be used for program evaluation, to inform instruction, or to share information with teachers and parents, among other uses. And our grantees today will primarily be talking about using SEL assessment for program evaluation. So now I'll hand it over to Jeremy Taylor from CASEL to talk about a new project they have related to SEL assessment.
All right, thank you, Diana.
Jeremy?
Yes, thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about a work group that CASEL has been spearheading. We're wrapping up our first year of a 3-year work group focused on practical social and emotional competence assessment. And before I dive in, I want to clarify one thing. CASEL does have an I3 project. We are collaborating with Penn State, Chicago Public Schools, and the American Institute for Research on an I3 project. But that's not what I'm here presenting on today. As I mentioned, it is on that national work group. So I just want to make sure that that is clarified. So when CASEL talks about social emotional learning, what we're talking about is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And I mentioned that up front because I know there are lots of different perspectives on social emotional learning and how people think about it, so just giving that context up front in terms of how we're sort of seeing that process. And in terms of the assessments we're really talking about those knowledge, skills, and attitudes in students, and that's the basis of this work group. So in terms of why we launched this work group and why we felt this area of work is so important, we recently partnered with Civic Enterprises and Peter D. Hartz and Associates and sampled more than 800 principals in a nationally representative sample. And what we found was that overwhelmingly, in fact, 99% of those principals felt like that these social and emotional skills were teachable, and overwhelmingly also said that they were committed to developing them in their students. In fact, 95% of them reported that they were committed. But they also said that most of them were not familiar with the current assessments that were available. Only 37% were familiar, and even fewer of them felt like their teachers were prepared to use the data from these assessments to inform instruction. So these results really highlighted for us the importance of focusing on this issue and providing some support to educators that were practical. So from that, we launched this work group. We are about to launch the work group's website at the end of the month, measuring SEL, using data to inspire practice, and we have 6 different organizations who are collaborating as steering committee partners, including CASEL, the core districts, Harvard and Stephanie Jones Taxonomy Project, the RAND Corporation, ex-SEL Labs, and Transforming Education. And thank you very much to our collaborators and as well as the many funders that are involved in this process. In addition to those steering committee members, there are over 30 different collaborators that are part of the work group overall as well. So the work group effort is divided into 4 main goals, and there are subgroups among those 30 or so collaborators that I mentioned that are working on these goals. The first goal is to collaborate and coordinate with the field generally around the assessment effort, the work group's efforts and related efforts in the field, and making sure that we're not sort of fragmented in the way we're approaching the work, being aware of ongoing developments that are happening, and we're building a collaborators network that's helping us stay connected to the field in this way. The second focus is to help demonstrate alignment and distinction between the many frameworks that are out there. Diana mentioned more than 100 frameworks that are out there, and we're trying to sort of do a review of the main ones that are out there in use and how they relate to each other and how they sort of align in a developmental way. The third goal of the work group, and the one we're going to focus on primarily today going forward, is to provide some practical and timely information to educators about how to select and use assessments. And this is going to take the form of a guide that is going to be available in beta form in the fall of this year and available as public launch in the beginning of 2018. And then finally, the fourth is a focus on practical performance measures, which is a design challenge that's happening annually. We're wrapping up our first year now. We're about to announce our year 1 winners, and we'll be opening up for a new round of submissions in the spring. So as I mentioned today, we're going to focus on that assessment guide and giving you all a little preview of what's to come when it launches in beta in the fall. So just some parameters. The guide is focused on assessments of pre-K to 12 students. We're focusing explicitly on measures only that are in use in practice, so not measures that are only used in research. And we're focusing on measures of students' interpersonal or intrapersonal competencies. So there's sort of our parameters of the guide. And the first step of the guide was to conduct a scan of the field of what is being used currently in practice. So we started in December, and since then we've been doing a scan of practitioners about which measures they're using, which age groups they're using them with, for what purpose they're using the measures, and how useful they're finding them. And so far to date, this number is a little bit out of date. We've gotten 225 responses. Checked this morning, we're actually up over 260 responses, but we've received several responses, and we identified already over 100 different measures in use. So again, really getting to the need to try to really communicate which measures are being used most effectively and for what purposes. And so one of the other things we asked in this scan is how useful people are finding the measures that they're identified. And overall, we're finding that people are finding them useful, although there are lots of different measures being reported. About 75% of them said that they found the measures that they identified as being useful either quite a bit or a lot. And in terms of what the uses that they are reporting are, the top 2 have been informing instruction, so sort of formative uses, and program evaluation of, or SEL program evaluation. followed closely by screening. And then the bottom two were teacher evaluation, and one that actually didn't even make it on the graph here was high stakes accountability. So one thing we also noticed during the scan is that there was a little bit of a disconnect and confusion about the purpose of the measures that were being reported. So one stage of this process was that we were following up with people who completed the scan and doing qualitative interviews with them about the measures that are being used. And during these interviews, we were trying to really understand sort of how the measures are used effectively and what they liked about the particular measure they were reporting. And what we concluded was that a lot of people who saw their use as being informative to instruction was actually closer to a screening process. And this really highlighted for us the need to try to be clear during in our guide about what measures we were trying to sort of encourage the use of and which ones we were not really focusing on. And so our group came together and concluded that there were 5 uses that we were going to focus on, which were informing classroom instruction, facilitating conversations with students and families, determining systemic SEL supports and resource needs, evaluating SEL program effectiveness, and reporting in non-individual performance, such as school report cards and things like that. The things that we were not going to focus on were things like screening for individual student deficits, teacher evaluation, and high-stakes accountability. So in the remaining few minutes I have here, I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of the main sections of the guide that you're going to see when it becomes available. This is just a mock-up. We're working with our designers right now to this is going to be an online web tool, so this is just sort of a rough mock-up here. But I'll go through the main sections here. So the top section, this is an example. The example that we're showing you is based on the DESA, but not all the information here is reflective of the actual ratings. Again, this is just a mock-up. The top section is going to show a few sentences that just give an overview of the measure. Usually this is going to be language that comes directly from the developer, often from their website. And then right below that, in that orange font, you'll see there is the actual whatever the constructs are that they're assessing. So if they're assessing self-awareness and self-management and social awareness, then you'll see those listed there. So whatever the measures are, or the concepts are they're measuring. In the next section below, labeled the basics, this is going to be a table that's just giving characteristics of the measure itself. So things like what grades was the measure developed for, how many items, how long does it take to give the measure, what language it's available in, whether there's training and technical assistance that's available, whether or not there's a cost, and if so, what the cost is. And within that table, there'll be hot links that actually links the user directly to resources from the developer or from the research as well. And then in this next section down below, labeled measure uses, this is where we get into sort of the practical element. So you see there's 5 different icons here. These 5 icons align with the 5 uses I mentioned before. And the way that it will work is each of these 5 uses will have with it an associated set of criteria that a measure will be reviewed against. So in order for a measure to be included for a particular use, it'll have to meet that criteria. So in order to demonstrate what the 5 uses were, all 5 icons are here, but this is not an actual rating of the DESA in this case. But so if a particular measure only met criteria for these first 3 uses on the left, then you only see those 3 icons. But then the way it will also work is the user will be able to click on any one of those 5 icons, or however many that are there for that measure. And when they click on the icon, what they'll see below is an actual vignette about what it looks like in practice to use a measure for that purpose. So it allows the user, which ideally we're focusing on practitioners as a user, to really get a sense for what this looks like in practice, information that comes directly from our qualitative interviews of real practitioners who are using measures, so that they can say, I want to know what it looks like to use a measure to inform instructional practice and decision making. So they can click on that use if the icon appears there for that measure, and then really get a sense for what that looks like through a vignette from the field. And so in addition to some of the stuff you're going to see here, there will also be some sort of front matter that gives some context to the user, like a review of some of the different coding criteria and how a measure got reviewed and things like that. But for today, this was kind of the preview. And I believe that's all for my time. So I'm going to hand it over to Laura at College Possible.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Laura Dreyer. I'm a senior manager with College Possible. So really briefly, a little bit about our program. We are a nonprofit college access and success program that serves low-income students across the country. We're also a 2014 I3 grantee. In our core programming, our students are paired with a near-peer coach every year, starting their junior year of high school through college graduation. And so our program has always been focused on the more logistical aspects of college access and success, things like increasing ACT and SAT scores, navigating the application process, finding scholarships and applying for financial aid, navigating the enrollment process, things like that. Our I3 project is focused on developing social-emotional skills as a means to decreasing the opportunity or the achievement gap. And so that's been a really exciting development for us to be able to focus more intently on social-emotional skills and the impact that that has on our students and their success. My computer is frozen at the moment, so I will advance the slides when I can, but I will keep talking in the meantime. The I3 project focused on social-emotional learning has allowed us to do two different things. One is to simultaneously build in more social-emotional skill development into our curriculum, while also embarking on an assessment to see how well we're actually doing that. So our first step was to identify, out of all of the definitions that Diana shared at the beginning of the presentation, what constructs of social-emotional learning that we, A, have the biggest opportunity to impact, and then also, B, what would move the needle the most on college success. So both what do we think we have the opportunity to impact, and also what do we want to impact. And so that process allowed us to zero in on three main competencies. The first was goal setting. So this is not just necessarily identifying long-term educational goals, although that's certainly a big part of it, but sort of helping students maintain that long view, particularly when the day-to-day gets rough or distracting, and then also to help students build connections between what's happening now and what outcomes they can expect later on. The second one we focused on was persistence. So both the action of persistence, of sticking with something, and then also the belief, making sure that students believe that they can do it and that it's worth the time and energy that they're putting into it. And then finally was social capital, leveraging resources both within school and outside. It's our strong belief that nobody navigates college successfully entirely on his or her own, and so we want to make sure that our students recognize, develop, and leverage those networks that they have available to them. So the first step was to incorporate these aspects more robustly into our curriculum so that we could focus more intently on them, and that curriculum was implemented for the first time in the 2016-17 program year that we're just wrapping up now. So our first challenge was to identify which constructs to focus on. Our second challenge was to then find the appropriate assessment tool. So I'm very excited about Jeremy's presentation. That guide would have been extremely helpful for us. So excited for programs that will be looking at that in the future. We found in exploring the different assessments that were out there that most of them were student self-assessments, which was appropriate for us given the scope of our evaluation and the age group that we're working with, in that we're looking at high school students. But we found that at the time, most of the available tools were primarily focused either on the skills and experiences of students within the classroom, so things with questions about things like school climate, teacher support, students' attitudes towards the content they were learning in their classes, or they were focused on what happens outside of school entirely, so things like family dynamics, hobbies, etc. So as an out-of-school time program that focuses on academics, we were somewhere in the middle, so it took us a while to find a tool that adequately addressed both sides of that coin. We did eventually find a tool that met our needs, and that was the REACH survey. The REACH survey is created by Search Institute, which is an organization based in Minneapolis that does research and applies the research to practice and education. And REACH stands for relationships, effort, aspirations, cognition, and heart. So it's a nice broad range that covers both those in-school and out-of-school experiences and skills that we were looking for. The first administration of this survey took place this fall to College Possible students and a comparison group of students in 18 high schools around the country. And that pre-assessment will establish the baseline against which we measure growth with a post-assessment that will take place next spring. So we're looking forward to those results to inform a couple of things for us. The first will be the curriculum. So I mentioned that we've been building out some new curriculum, and this survey will really help us assess how effective it is and whether we can make further adjustments. And then the other thing is training and how we train our coaches to deliver the content to their students. So we're not going to have final results until 2019, but we have started collecting more informal feedback from our coaches in the meantime. And we've learned that the biggest takeaway so far is that the skills that it takes to teach students how to appropriately use a semicolon or complete the FAFSA are not necessarily the same skills required to teach a growth mindset or goal setting. And so we're already doing some thinking about how we can better equip coaches to embrace these ideas themselves and then also to teach it effectively to their students. But certainly the formal evaluation results in 2019 will be extremely informative to help us understand where our approach is successful and where we can continue to improve in our services to our students. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Amanda from the Erickson Institute.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Moreno, faculty at Erickson Institute and the principal investigator of the project, of the I3 project called Com Classroom K2. I will be co-presenting with the lead evaluator on my project, who is Stephen Baker, so he'll be talking in a little bit. So we're going to the totally other end of the age spectrum that Lara just talked about. We're focused on the primary grades, kindergarten through second grade. So every age range has its own challenges, and early childhood is no exception to that. So Com Classroom K2 project implements a mindfulness-based social-emotional learning program. So it's a comprehensive SEL program, but the core of it are these mindfulness techniques. You can see in the photo there, that's an actual student from a second grade class in our project, doing that 3 times a day, every day. So it's a regular practice that they do. And there are other elements of the program that help children apply these skills that they learn sort of internally in the mindfulness techniques, externally to the challenges that face them every day, whether it's learning a new lesson or negotiating with a peer on the playground. The outcomes that we think should be reached by this intervention include self-regulation and executive function, and SEL skills. So we kind of separate that out because, again, in early childhood, it's not exactly known what is the overlap between these highly related constructs. So that relates to our approach to SEL measurement that Stephen will be talking about in a bit. Also, school engagement, so how much does doing mindfulness practices and related activities help kids focus that newly found energy, that newly found calm and focus back into the engagement, the activities of the school day, and of course, academic performance over the long term. So in terms of the competencies that we were interested in, for early childhood in particular, it may be important to get all different angles on this. So we measure this at both the child level and the classroom level. As you can see there, we have a teacher report, which again is pretty standard for early childhood because it's not as easy to do something like the REACH survey that Lara talked about with young children. Surveying very young children is difficult to do, so we get teacher report. And we also get objective observers, so people coming into the classroom not knowing whether they're treatment or control, looking at things like positive climate, the engagement that I talked about, and then perhaps the opposite of engagement, disruptive behavior. But when thinking about you know, the mechanism of action of our program, I like to use the formal term special sauce for that. So what's really the thing about our program that we think is going to be reaching children and having a big impact? We felt that these measures that we had were important but didn't cover some of the crux of that, some of that special sauce. So there's that sense of belonging construct that you see there, where we felt it was really important to get the child's voice, the child's own thoughts about this. And so, like I said, doing a standard survey is very difficult, and so we felt that we needed to really create our own measure to look at this. So this is an exploratory thing, and we will be describing this process of developing a measure that allowed us to get the child's voice, and part of that will be kind of the child corroborating the teacher report, but part of it are things that a teacher cannot report on. For example, the child reports on if they feel that the teacher likes them or not. And so this is a way of not just, you know, getting the child's perspective, but also measuring some constructs that just cannot be measured in another way, such as through asking the teacher. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this to Stephen, who's going to talk about our development process and what this measure is all about. Okay.
Thanks, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. This is Stephen Baker, leading the, as Amanda said, leading the evaluation, the independent evaluation at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. On this slide are some of the hurdles we tried, as we tried to get at this issue of belonging, as Amanda described it. And some of these challenges are particular, at least our experiences are particular to this study and this setting, and others I think are common. The first one there is time. You know, SEL efforts have to figure out where to fit their curriculum within whatever structure, whether it's a school day or an after-school program. And the same thing, of course, applies for assessing. We had an existing block of time with individual students where we were already measuring math and language and self-regulation, and we had a small window, a very small window, to add any new measure to try to get at this issue of belonging. The self-report is the second bullet point there. Obviously, young children often, you know, they don't know what they don't know. There are real limits on metacognition. And so we needed to be grounded as much as possible in behaviors. And so we wanted to be attentive to that. And of course, anyone who's spent time in classrooms watching children and teachers interact know that there are lots of things that happen with kids and their experiences and emotions that they aren't able to explain or even comprehend. These social interactions can be kind of confusing. So there are natural limits on what kids can self-report. Parents, the third bullet point there, parents are difficult to access, and we really wanted to understand the school setting as much as possible. Parents don't have that first-person information about schools, especially in these very nuanced experiences kids have. And as Amanda said, like teachers, they aren't able to report on the sort of interior thinking that kids have. You know, there are limitations on how much teachers know, you know, at any pretest. Their expectations as they continue to be trained in a program and to use a program may change at the end, and so those are another things to consider. This is also a study that's set up so that we're looking at outcomes over 2 years, and we have movement of kids across grades, of course, and so we get some changes we get changes in teachers that also limit the sorts of things you can get from their reports. So as Jeremy noted, there are shortcomings of surveys, and this slide shows you where we ended up. And let me describe a little bit about it and how we got there. We adapted a format called the Berkeley Puppet Interview, as it says. And in that original format, there are adult assessors, trained assessors, who have puppets with them, and they ask students questions, and the students respond with open-ended answers. So you might have one of these puppets. You can see on the slide a little bit, they've got name tags on them. You can tell the one on the left is Iggy and the one on the right is Ziggy. But in the original format, Iggy would say something like, I have lots of friends, and Ziggy would say, I don't have lots of friends, and then the child would be asked, how about you? And then in the original version, the kids are video recorded, and later assessors review those recordings and code the responses. And that's a terrific way to understand students, young children, and it's really, really compelling that there's a way to get student reports that align with what teachers and parents report about them, and so a very powerful tool. And there was no way we could do it in this study. We just finished up, we're actually just finishing up assessing about 1,200 students across 30 schools, wherever schools could fit us, a cafeteria, a teacher's lounge, typically many kids in the same room at the same time. There are other resource constraints that made it impossible to use that approach. And so what we did instead was we video recorded the puppets and then put those recordings on an iPad with headphones. And instead of asking kids the open-ended question, how about you, we asked, as you can see in this slide, we asked, are you more like, and then pointed to the Iggy or Ziggy on the screen. And then after that, got a sense from them whether that was sort of a big true for them, a medium true for them. And of course, our goal was to make kids feel as comfortable answering, either direction in their responses. And so we tried to prompt them by letting them know that kids feel all kinds of things and do all kinds of things, and so on. Here's there are 4 things that said on the slide. So here are 4 things for our experience. I think I want to, the first bullet point, I want to echo what Laura said and her experience. The heart of this was a series of back and forth conversations between Amanda and her team developing the intervention, and me and my team wanting to make sure we were measuring something that was likely to actually change over time and change because of what was happening in CCK2. We didn't start with the idea of the term belonging, but it's one that we worked our way to it. And so the extent to which this measure will be good at all begins with the connection it has to the actual work and the sort of deepest intentions of the intervention. Bullet 2 there argues against what we did. We didn't plan to develop a new measure. It isn't something I'm necessarily recommending. As Amanda said, this is an exploratory thing. This is a situation where we felt pretty good about some of our other measures. They're standardized. They have known psychometric properties, and that includes the academic measures, where we're using items from the Woodcock-Johnson. We're using an NIH implementation of the flanker test. But this was an opportunity for us to stretch and to do that. But having said that, obviously, there are a lot of risks in doing this. It takes a lot of additional work. And so I just want to emphasize that even though this is where we ended up for this part of this study for our purposes, I would still say seek the existing measures first. And so, again, Jeremy's resources there are going to be terrifically helpful. Third bullet point, measuring context and not just individual skills. This is one that, I've just been thinking a lot about the field's desire to have good measures and what to measure and how to even describe or characterize what it is that we're trying to measure when we're measuring these things, skills, the extent to which these are really skills that can be taught. And again, back to Laura's point about sort of different kinds of learning and different kinds of skills and what's required to support those and so forth. So at the moment anyway, I'm really focused on context, the importance of context, and here we did want to ground the experience, kids' experience as much as possible in the context of the school. So there are social emotional experiences and competencies within particular settings, informed again by some of the other measures we have, things like the emotional climate of the classroom and so forth. And the last point I would make here is just, again, I think something that Jeremy emphasized about why measures are chosen and why they're used. I have a personal aversion to high-stakes evaluation stuff, but knowing whether it's high stakes or whether it's program development or implementation fidelity. Our priority here was research, but we also have items that can be used to help teachers understand how their kids are experiencing school. So let me pass this back to Diana, and I think she's going to lead us through the rest of the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen, and thanks to all of the presenters. I wanted to kick off some questions and answers with these questions for all of you. And just a reminder to all participants, if you have any questions for our panelists, please enter it in the chat box and we'll take those as well. So first question to start off with, what are considerations for schools, districts, and out-of-school time providers approaching SEL assessment? And Laura, let's start with you.
Sure. I think that I would maybe just come back to a couple of the things that both I highlighted and that was highlighted by the Erickson Institute in terms of considerations and how those play out. And I would say that's largely which competencies within social emotional learning you want to focus on. I think that Diana made the point really well at the beginning, just how broad that category is. And not everyone shares the same understanding of what it even means. And so making sure that you're getting on the same page with your team members about what aspects of that are most compelling or important for your project or for your school or your district. And then, again, I think the other major consideration is what type of assessment is most developmentally appropriate for the group of students that you're working with. So, in our case, working with high school students, we can rely on them to do a self-assessment that can be relatively informative as opposed to working with much younger students where different approaches and more creativity are going to be needed.
Thanks, Laura. Sorry, I was on mute. See, Amanda and Stephen, do you have anything to add to that? How to start out approaching SEL assessment?
This is Amanda. What I was going to say is just in listening to Jeremy's talk as well, when he was talking about how it's very important to the CASEL initiative to make sure that they're looking at measures that are in use by schools in the real world and that they're practical. And that is definitely a consideration for even these newly developed measures, including the one Stephen and I talked about. So, for example, a lot of things went into that consideration to make sure that it would be more practically usable in the real world, such as that distinction between more of an open-ended response versus how we're using it, which is a forced choice scale, which ends up being a 4-point scale that any assessor could easily just, put a quick check mark right in the moment. pretty easily. But kind of on the flip side of that, I wanted to just add that all measures, if they are valid and reliable, have, research and some, involved in it. In order for a measure to become a credible measure, there's, research is involved in the process. And so, in terms of the practical uses of these things, they need to be usable by the end user, but we also need to make sure that we're, allowing for, at a minimum, the consultation of a researcher who's, been trained on the measure, is familiar with scoring procedures, can help the quote-unquote end user make those practical steps. But I don't think that we're at a point in the field, maybe particularly with SEL, because it is somewhat more of a, it's more of a, as they say, soft skill, which is not a term that I love. But in other words, we're not at a very advanced point in measuring this, which is why we're all here talking about it. So I think we're still at a point where if you're implementing a process in your school, you need to make sure that you've got the right staff, the right talent, the right consultation to make sure that it's being implemented as developed, as intended originally by the research that created the measure.
Thanks, Amanda. Stephen, do you have anything to add about considerations approaching SEL assessment?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I would add that I think that hasn't been said is just the implementation argument. I've been reading a book called The Checklist Manifesto, which is one of those helpful reminders that it's always important just to remember to do the basics. And so implementation really matters. So I've been assessing a different program, not this, the CCK2 program, and talking and doing an implementation follow-up. And because SEL is still secondary and it has that second-class citizenship, I'm just reflecting on a conversation the other day where the time that was set aside for the SEL programming was actually being used by teachers as make-up time for academic work. They had kids who had arrived late, or kids who hadn't made it through all the work they were supposed to do, the academic work, and so they were using this time that had been allocated for SEL programs to the things that they knew that kids were going to be graded on and that kids were going to be assessed on. And so it's just a reminder that because, I think, again, partly because of the status of social emotional learning, the current social status of it, that you really have to pay attention to implementation. So, I beg your forgiveness for saying the obvious, but that's very much on my mind as I think about considerations as schools really approach assessment. You can get to the end of the year, assess something on the assumption that you have done, and this was, I should say, this was the assumption in the schools where I've been, where the administrators were supportive of it, they believed in it, they thought that they had set up dedicated times for this to happen. They thought that the value of it was so obvious that teachers would take to it. They had good training in the fall and so forth. And yet it was easily crowded out. So that's my thing.
No, that's a great point. And I think, with any assessment, where do you fit it in into the schedule? It's something that can be easily overlooked, but so important to make sure it happens. So before we get to our second question on this panel discussion, I wanted to take some questions from the audience. So let's see, I have a question from Jim Malamut, who is asking, directing this to Jeremy, but I'll ask any of the others to answer as well. What are some of the other categories of measures that practitioners are using besides surveys or self-reports? So Jeremy, do you want to take that? And then if anyone else has anything to add, they can as well.
Sure, yeah. So I think what we've seen come through is we've seen some observational measures, some performance measures. Many of those are technology-based. Sometimes they're sort of kind of digital situational judgment type tasks. Some game-based measures that are coming through that are really interesting, which kind of blur the lines a little bit between assessment and sort of skill building, where they kind of putting kids in scenarios and games and assessing as they go along in an adaptive way how they're reacting in certain situations, but then the content of the game is also trying to sort of provide some instruction around skills. So there's a few different ways that are approaching it that I think are pretty interesting. And I look forward to being able to announce the winners of the design challenge, which is focused specifically on non-survey based measures. We should be able to announce those within the next month, but I think there's some promising things out there, but it's still early days.
Great. All right. Let's see, someone had a question that was directed to Stephen, but again, I think anyone can answer. It's about how to separate the interplay between the social context and individual SEL capacities. And I would say it looks like we have some similar questions that are asking about, I hope these are similar, asking about how to address potential teacher bias in assessing students, particularly across cultural norms. Stephen, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, and I'm going to take myself off the hook by saying I don't have an answer to this. I mean, my immediate thought is that I realize I'm just sort of pushing more toward context, and by that I mean to me an evaluation. Let's see. So I think that individual programs are often asked to prove things that they're not in a position to prove. I mean, the work that we're doing on this particular project is large enough, it's well-resourced enough that we can actually answer questions that I think will contribute to the social science literature about this work. So for any individual program, it's always a question of what you are going to take for granted. What are you going to take as a given? And I think this issue is resonating with me because I'm compelled by the evidence about the importance of context. I'm compelled by the research that shows that if you can create certain kinds of learning environments, you know, where kids feel autonomy, where kids have a sense of their competence being reinforced, where there's a sense of relatedness with kids and teachers, that if you can create those settings, that there's good reason to believe that's a good thing for kids and that we should be doing that. And part of this, of course, is just, you know, the political arguments about having to measure outcomes versus processes and so forth. So I confess that I'm not, right at the moment, I'm not thinking as much about how to balance these as I'm thinking about how to try to, in individual conversations with programs, trying to emphasize the value of being able to measure something that I believe has been demonstrated elsewhere in a convincing fashion is important, and seeing whether the stakeholders are willing to accept that. I mean, that's obviously where it ultimately ends up, whether it's a board of directors or whoever it is, what they will accept as compelling information that they are doing something that helps kids. So, yeah, I guess that's where I'm at the moment in thinking about that. It's really more trying to move away. I mean, both thinking about specific measures like we've talked about here today, but then also trying to back up and just argue for the baseline value of settings that are more easily measured and that don't require change over time measures, individual level. You can simply demonstrate whether the settings are appropriate. Now, one other thing to add, obviously that creates challenges for transferability. There's a program that I'm working with that's a summer program that's also involved with a school district. And so being able to create an environment in one setting that helps kids does not guarantee that the kids will demonstrate these specific skills the next academic year in the school, and that, you know, that's still a conversation. But I'll pause. I'll stop there.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Laura, did you have any experience as you were, you know, working within your project, seeing any bias from teachers or any context issues that might impact the assessment with your REACH survey?
Yeah, it's an interesting question from our perspective, given that our assessment tool is a self-assessment, so students are taking it, and so we have worked really hard to make sure that the administration of the surveys is consistent to try to avoid any kind of bias there. And then really the fact that we are measuring both college possible students as well as comparison students within their same schools, and that we're doing this study across 18 different high schools in 7 different districts in 4 different states, allows us to sort of isolate some of those factors that gives us increased confidence in the impact of our programming versus what are some of the effects of the more contextual pieces that students may be experiencing in their school environments. And so in some ways I think that I'm not a great person to answer this question because of those factors, but we are specifically trying to isolate the impact of College Possibles programming on social emotional growth while controlling for as many other variables as possible.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, did you see this come up in your assessment working group, the issue of either cultural bias or context or teacher bias?
It certainly is part of the discussions that we're having, and I think one thing that's important is to make sure that no single survey is the only data point that's used in evaluating a student or class, or and so that you may have teacher reports, but that you're also using student voice to hear their own perspective on their own skills and as well as families, and that you as schools or as school districts that you systematically and routinely look at how well those things are aligned, and if you see discrepancies between how students see themselves or how families see students and how teachers are reporting, then really having some conversations about are those differences related to differences in how kids are sort of functioning in those different environments, or are they actually around some professional development that might need to happen around the teachers' assessments and how they're using them and their perceptions. And it isn't just about student social emotional competence that we have to think about, right? It's also about the adults in the schools, and the best way to foster these competencies in kids is to model them through adults, right? So helping us all as adults to think about our own competencies, which includes how we perceive others, right, is something that is important and part of our discussion as well, for sure.
All right, thanks. There's a couple questions that have come in around the use of these SEL assessments, and specifically, is using them to identify individual student deficits, is that kind of a misapplication of these assessments? Let's see, Amanda, do you have any thoughts on that, using assessments to identify student deficits?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on it. I think the general idea, and again, consistent with the effort that Jeremy described, is that we are really talking about Tier 1, or otherwise known as the universal level of SEL. It's not that the other levels don't exist. So Tiers 2 and 3 would be for kids that are quote-unquote at risk or are already identified for some kind of issue. The field is I think a little bit more focused on Tier 1 at this point, because we want to first make sure that we have schools that are creating environments that are conducive to this skill building and to creating environments where students feel a sense of belonging, regardless of whether they have a particular skill deficit. In other words, we can't focus on a deficit without first knowing that we're not creating those deficits or exacerbating them. But of course, all teachers and principals are concerned as well about their students that are already identified or already, creating, showing that they may have some particular challenges that need additional services. And so, personnel in schools, such as social workers, counselors, are typically those that, become involved when there are specific concerns. Now, having said that, I think we do think of Tier 1 programs as well as Tier 1 measures as things that can be used to direct instruction or can be used to modify practice in the classroom. Maybe not to create an IEP for any one particular child, but to adjust what you're doing so that you're meeting the needs of your classroom in general. And that definitely is an appropriate use of these Tier 1 measures.
Great, thank you. Any of the other panelists want to add to that question about using assessments to identify student deficits?
This is Laura. I'll maybe just add that one of the things that has been helpful for us is that we are using a third-party evaluator to conduct our evaluation, and so the data that we see is only de-identified and only in aggregate, and so that sort of helps us be more careful about not sort of falling into the trap of using these measures to measure individual student deficits. But at the same time, I think that's still an important mindset piece for how our program approaches our students more generally. And so I think that that's a piece that we need to be really thoughtful about in training and in our curriculum development, even though it's not targeting individual students, to sort of avoid a deficit mindset more generally is also a really important factor in all of this.
Great, thank you. I think, Jeremy, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I would just add from the guide's perspective, we're also trying to encourage that by one of the requirements for any measure to be considered will be that it is the questions in the measure are positively oriented and they're strengths-based. And SEL as an approach to education is a strengths-based approach, and so the idea of trying to measure deficits, if what we're trying to identify is a problem behavior or a deficit of some sort, there are lots of clinical measures already out there, right? So I don't think that's a void that SEL needs to fill, but we really want to encourage that the perspective is on fostering and building these competencies and these strengths. So hopefully sort of raising up the measures that are doing that is one way to do that.
All right, great. I think we might have time for just one last quick question. A few questions have come in about using assessments like the one that Stephen and Amanda developed or others across different age levels. If it was intended for grades K through 2, using it in higher grade levels. What do you think about that? Is that something that you can do, or do you really need to use the assessment for the grade it was intended?
Well, I saw that question, and I thought it was really interesting the way it was positioned because of this issue of survey saturation in the older grades. So I don't think the question was saying, can we use, Iggy and Ziggy particularly for older kids, but just more this issue of, can we use more engaging assessments that aren't just, kind of bombarding older kids with survey after survey. And we certainly can. And again, this challenge that CASEL has going on is focused on performance-based tasks across the age range. So, as we've all been talking about, this can involve things like computer games, things that are on the on a tablet that have to do with reaction time or responding to various scenarios. So if this happened, what would you do kind of tasks. So those certainly do have credibility in older ages, but like anything else, they would have to have, we'd have to prove first that they can't, that particular use of the measure can be used with that particular age range. But the questioner is correct in that, those not a lot of those exist right now. They are pretty rare. Clark McCown's sort of compendium of measures is one example of some performance-based measures that have been used with elementary, level students. But that's the whole point that we're talking about today, is because we need more measures like that that are more interesting, engaging, and performance-based.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And that, I think, is a good place to end. I just want to thank everyone who attended today and thank all our panelists and presenters for sharing all their work and all their learnings for today. And I hope you all have a nice afternoon and a nice weekend. Thank you.